Grace Kelly's wedding was sold to the world as the greatest fairy tale of the 20th century. For decades, that's exactly how the story has been told. But behind the veil and the tiara was a far messier story involving a multi-million-dollar payment, a secret medical exam, a billionaire pulling strings behind the scenes, and a family history stuffed with more scandal than anything Hollywood ever put on screen. Stick around, because the real story of this marriage is nothing like the fairy tale you grew up hearing. The prince with something to prove. Long before Grace Kelly ever set foot in Monaco, Prince Rainier III was already the product of a family with a complicated and, frankly, messy history. He was born on May 31st, 1923, at the Prince's Palace in Monaco, the son of Princess Charlotte and a French nobleman named Pierre de Polignac. Charlotte herself had been born out of wedlock, the illegitimate daughter of Monaco's previous ruler, Prince Louis II, and a young laundress of Algerian descent, only later formally recognized and adopted so she could eventually inherit the throne. It was an origin story that the Grimaldi family worked hard to smooth over in official histories for decades, even as it remained an open secret within European aristocratic circles. Rainier's own parents divorced when he was just 6 years old, leaving him caught in the middle of a bitter and very public separation that shaped much of his early childhood. He was largely raised apart from both parents for stretches of his youth, sent away to boarding schools in England and Switzerland, an upbringing that biographers have since suggested left him guarded and somewhat emotionally distant well into his adult years, qualities that would later shape his approach to both his throne and his own eventual marriage. Those who knew him during his university years at Montpellier and later at the Institute of Political Studies in Paris often described a young man who kept his true feelings carefully guarded, presenting a composed, dignified exterior, even as he privately navigated the complicated legacy of his own fractured family, a reserve that would remain characteristic of him for the rest of his life, even in his most public moments as a reigning monarch. As Rainier grew into adulthood and eventually inherited the throne in 1949, his own personal life was far from tidy. For years, he was in a serious relationship with a French actress named Gisèle Pascal, a romance so well known throughout Monaco that locals reportedly referred to her affectionately as their uncrowned princess, a nickname that spoke to just how seriously the Monegasque public had come to view their young ruler's long-term companion. When Rainier eventually told his advisors he intended to marry her, he was informed of an unusual requirement, one that would resurface just a few years later under very different circumstances. Because producing an heir was considered a matter of national survival for the tiny principality, any future bride would need to undergo a medical evaluation to confirm she was capable of bearing children. Pascal provided a letter from her own doctors, but the romance ultimately fell apart anyway, reportedly after she chose to resume her own acting career rather than fully commit to palace life, and Rainier's search for a suitable royal bride continued. Meanwhile, behind the walls of the palace itself, an entirely separate scandal had already threatened to derail Rainier's reign altogether. Early in his time as ruler, a financial crisis erupted involving the embezzlement of funds from Monaco's famous casino, the primary source of income for the entire tiny nation. A scandal that exposed just how fragile the principality's finances truly were, even before the broader tourism slump of the following years began taking its own toll. Making matters worse, Rainier's own sister, Princess Antoinette, was reportedly involved in a romantic affair with a member of Monaco's National Council at the time, and the two allegedly conspired together, hoping to use the resulting financial chaos to push Rainier off the throne entirely in favor of Antoinette's own young son. A plot that, had it succeeded, would have fundamentally altered the entire course of Monaco's royal history decades before Grace Kelly ever entered the picture. It was, in other words, a royal household already well acquainted with scandal, secrecy, and financial desperation, long before an American movie star ever entered the picture. The businessman who engineered a fairy tale. By the early 1950s, Monaco's financial situation had grown genuinely dire. The principality's economy depended almost entirely on revenue from its famous casino, but that casino was steadily losing business to newer, flashier gambling destinations, opening up elsewhere across Europe, drawing away the wealthy international clientele that Monaco had relied on for generations. Enter Aristotle Onassis, the enormously wealthy Greek shipping magnate who had, by this point, acquired significant financial interests and property holdings throughout Monaco, including a controlling stake in the very company that owned the casino itself. Onassis had a considerable personal stake in seeing the tiny principality's fortunes turn around, and according to accounts later given by Hollywood producer Robert Evans, it was Onassis himself who first floated the idea that would eventually reshape the entire trajectory of Rainier's life. Onassis reportedly told Rainier directly that the right kind of royal bride could do for Monaco's tourism industry exactly what the coronation of Queen Elizabeth had recently done for tourism across Great Britain, drawing global attention and, more importantly, global visitors and their money. It was a calculated, almost coldly commercial pitch, dressed up in the language of romance. And Onassis, ever the businessman, understood precisely how much publicity and how much cash a genuine fairy tale wedding could generate for a struggling casino economy that badly needed both. Given that his own financial fortunes remained directly tied to whatever could be done to restore the principality's fading glamour and appeal among Europe's wealthiest travellers. Some accounts even suggest that Onassis played a quiet, behind-the-scenes role in encouraging and facilitating the eventual match once Grace Kelly entered the picture, recognizing almost immediately just how perfectly her Hollywood glamour could be leveraged to achieve exactly the kind of publicity windfall he had been hoping for. With that idea planted, the search for the right bride began in earnest. And as fate, or perhaps some very deliberate matchmaking, would have it, an opportunity soon presented itself involving one of the biggest movie stars in the entire world. A meeting arranged by a journalist. In May of 1955, Grace Kelly traveled to the south of France for the Cannes Film Festival, promoting her latest Alfred Hitchcock picture, To Catch a Thief, a film that, fittingly enough, was itself set along the same glamorous French Riviera coastline, where her real-life romance would soon unfold. It was there, through a chain of social connections involving actress Olivia de Havilland and her husband, a magazine editor named Pierre Galante, that a meeting was arranged between Kelly and Prince Rainier at his royal palace. Galante reportedly thought the pairing would make for an interesting magazine feature, never imagining the meeting would eventually lead to an actual royal wedding. The meeting itself did not go entirely smoothly. Kelly had overslept that morning, and Monaco happened to be experiencing an electrical strike that day, leaving her without power to properly prepare. She arrived at the palace with damp, hastily styled hair, decorated with flowers, and wearing a wrinkled dress. Hardly the picture-perfect first impression one might expect for a future princess meeting her prince. By most accounts, it wasn't love at first sight for Kelly at all, and the initial meeting between the two remained fairly brief and formal. Despite the less than glamorous circumstances of their introduction, a connection between the two began to form, though by most accounts it developed more through an extended written correspondence over the following months than any immediate spark of romance. The two exchanged letters regularly throughout the remainder of 1955, slowly building a genuine rapport despite living an ocean apart and having spent only a matter of hours together in person, with Rainier reportedly finding himself increasingly drawn to Kelly's intelligence and composure in her letters, qualities that had come through only briefly during their brief, chaotic first meeting in Monaco. Rainier eventually made the trip to Philadelphia himself, arriving at the Kelly family home on Christmas night of 1955, accompanied, notably, by his own personal physician and a priest, a detail that made the true nature and purpose of the visit unmistakably clear to everyone involved, even before a single word about marriage had officially been spoken. Just 3 days later, on December 28th, 1955, the engagement was announced, setting off one of the most heavily covered celebrity news stories of the entire decade. But before that engagement could become official, there were several very specific, very unromantic conditions that needed to be met first. The price of a princess. Before the wedding could move forward, Grace Kelly was required to undergo the exact same kind of medical fertility evaluation that Rainier's previous girlfriend, Giselle Pascal, had once been asked to complete years earlier. Given the political and dynastic stakes involved, palace officials insisted on medical confirmation that Kelly would be capable of producing an heir to secure the future of the Grimaldi line, a request that reportedly unsettled both Kelly and her family, though she ultimately agreed and passed the examination without complication. To avoid drawing public attention or speculation to the true purpose of the visit, palace representatives reportedly arranged an elaborate cover story involving an unrelated medical specialist to obscure exactly what kind of examination was actually taking place. Since Rainier understood that most Americans would likely find the entire concept both baffling and more than a little insulting, particularly given how deeply personal and invasive such a requirement would have seemed to anyone unfamiliar with the practical realities of European royal succession. Then came the matter of money, and this particular detail proved even more contentious within the Kelly family. Following European aristocratic custom, Grace's family was informed that a dowry would need to be paid to the House of Grimaldi as part of finalizing the marriage, a sum reportedly set at $2 million, an extraordinary amount of money in 1956, worth well over $20 million in today's currency. Grace's father, a self-made millionaire who had built his fortune from nothing as a bricklayer turned construction magnate, was reportedly furious at the request, insisting that no daughter of his needed to pay any man for the privilege of marrying her, a reaction that reportedly caused genuine tension within the family during the weeks leading up to the formal engagement announcement. Despite his initial outrage, he ultimately relented, and the dowry was paid, using a combination of Grace's own Hollywood earnings and her family's personal fortune, a financial sacrifice that would end up mattering a great deal more to Grace's own long-term finances than anyone fully appreciated at the time. Adding another layer of business calculation to the entire affair, MGM Studios, the film company that still held Grace under contract at the time, agreed to release her from her remaining obligations in exchange for the exclusive rights to broadcast the wedding ceremony itself to television audiences across the globe. It meant that even Grace's freedom from her own studio contract had effectively become another financial transaction woven into the larger business arrangement surrounding her marriage, a wedding that, from nearly every conceivable angle, had been carefully engineered as much as it had been genuinely fallen into. Even Grace's now famous wedding gown, an elaborate creation of silk taffeta and delicate lace, had been designed and constructed entirely by MGM's own wardrobe department under designer Helen Rose, and gifted to her as part of the broader arrangement, meaning that even the most iconic image of the entire event, the bride herself walking down the aisle, had technically been produced and paid for by a Hollywood studio rather than the bride or her family. One final touch of commercial calculation, woven into a day the world would remember for generations as the very picture of romantic fantasy. The wedding of the century. On April 18th and 19th of 1956, Grace Kelly and Prince Rainier were married in a two-part ceremony required under Monegasque law, beginning with a civil service inside the palace's throne room, followed the next day by a lavish religious ceremony at St. Nicholas Cathedral. The scale of media attention surrounding the event was almost unprecedented for its era, with nearly 2,000 journalists descending on the tiny principality, and one bridesmaid later recalling that there appeared to be more members of the press present than actual wedding guests. MGM's broadcast of the ceremony reportedly reached more than 30 million viewers across Europe alone, an astonishing figure for television in the mid-1950s, at a time when television itself was still a relatively new technology in many households across the continent. The guest list for the religious ceremony included an extraordinary collection of celebrities and dignitaries, among them Cary Grant, Ava Gardner, and, notably, Aristotle Onassis himself, the very man whose business instincts had helped set the entire union into motion in the first place, arriving as an honoured guest at a wedding that his own quiet manoeuvring had done so much to bring about. During the ceremony, the couple reportedly spoke their vows so quietly that observers in the cathedral struggled to determine whether they were even speaking in English or French, adding an almost surreal, hushed quality to a ceremony otherwise defined by its overwhelming scale and spectacle. Two people whispering deeply personal vows to one another, while nearly 2,000 journalists and dignitaries watched on from every corner of the packed cathedral. Despite the grandeur surrounding the occasion, Grace herself reportedly offered a wry, knowing observation about the entire spectacle, quietly remarking to those close to her that the event felt less like a wedding of the century and more like an entire carnival built around her marriage. Her son, Prince Albert, later confirmed that both his parents found the sheer scale and intensity of the event completely overwhelming, recalling that his mother described the whole experience as exhausting, almost beyond words, and that the newly married couple were reportedly so drained by the end of it all that they simply fell asleep on their wedding night rather than beginning their honeymoon with any real celebration, choosing instead to depart quietly aboard Rainier's private yacht for a Mediterranean cruise, meant to finally offer them their first real moments of privacy in months. It was a dazzling, headline-grabbing spectacle watched by millions, but underneath all that glamour sat a bride who, by several accounts from biographers examining her life more closely in later years, was carrying a personal history considerably more complicated than the pure, wholesome image Hollywood and the Monegasque royal family had carefully constructed for public consumption. A complicated past before the crown. According to claims made by biographer Lawrence Leamer in his book examining the private lives of several of Alfred Hitchcock's leading actresses, Grace Kelly's personal history before her marriage was considerably more complex than her carefully polished public image suggested. Leamer alleges that as a teenager studying at New York's American Academy of Dramatic Arts, Kelly became romantically involved with one of her acting instructors, a man roughly a decade older than her who, at the time, remained legally married, though separated from his own wife. According to Leamer's account, Kelly was genuinely infatuated with the relationship, even introducing the instructor to her own parents, though her family reportedly disapproved given his marital status, viewing the relationship as entirely inappropriate for a young woman from their respectable Philadelphia background. Leamer further claims that around this same period, Kelly was simultaneously involved with another man entirely, the wealthy international socialite Ali Khan, son of a prominent religious leader and himself notorious throughout European high society for his own string of romantic entanglements with some of the era's most famous women. According to this same account, Kelly proved remarkably adept at managing multiple relationships and admirers simultaneously throughout this period of her life, drawing people into her orbit with apparent ease, even while maintaining a public image of wholesome, all-American sweetness that stood in sharp contrast to the more complicated private reality Lima describes. These claims, drawn primarily from a single biographical source, rather than corroborated across multiple contemporary accounts, paint a picture of a young woman navigating a far more complicated and, by the standards of her era, considerably more scandalous romantic life than the pristine, girl next door image she would later cultivate as one of Hollywood's most celebrated leading ladies. It's worth noting that such claims remain difficult to verify with complete certainty decades after the fact, and Kelly herself never publicly addressed these specific allegations during her own lifetime, leaving the full truth of her earlier romantic history somewhat contested among biographers and historians who have studied her life in the decades since, with some pointing to the sheer volume of circumstantial detail in Lima's account as evidence of careful research, while others caution that posthumous claims about a public figure's private romantic history should always be weighed with a healthy degree of skepticism, particularly when they rely so heavily on second-hand recollections gathered so many decades after the events themselves supposedly took place. Whatever the full truth of her earlier romantic history, Grace Kelly stepped into her role as Princess of Monaco, carrying a past that, had it become fully public at the time, likely would have significantly complicated the fairy tale narrative that the palace and MGM had worked so carefully to construct around her marriage. But it wouldn't be her own past that ultimately proved most difficult to manage. It would be the day-to-day reality of actually living inside the gilded, tightly controlled world she had just married into. Life inside the gilded cage. Almost immediately after her wedding, Grace Kelly discovered that becoming a princess meant giving up nearly everything that had defined her independent adult life up to that point. She retired entirely from acting, having completed 11 feature films by the time of her marriage, and she would never appear in another motion picture for the remainder of her life, despite reportedly receiving several tempting offers from major directors in the years that followed, including a serious inquiry from Alfred Hitchcock himself for a later project he hoped she might star in. Monaco's rigid social and political customs made any return to her acting career essentially unthinkable, regardless of her personal wishes on the matter, and reports suggest that when she seriously considered accepting at least one of these later offers, the backlash from Monaco's own citizens and political establishment was severe enough that she ultimately abandoned the idea entirely. Beyond the loss of her career, Grace found herself navigating an entirely unfamiliar and, by many accounts, genuinely difficult new environment. The tight-knit, insular culture of Monaco's aristocracy did not always warmly embrace their new American-born princess, and Grace's naturally outspoken personality occasionally clashed with the far more reserved, formal expectations of European royal protocol. Even her charitable work came with friction, as members of a Red Cross committee she was appointed to lead reportedly grumbled privately about her leadership style and her distinctly American approach to getting things done, viewing her direct manner as somewhat brash compared to the more circumspect style traditionally favoured within European aristocratic charity circles. The adjustment extended well beyond simple culture clashes as well. Grace reportedly struggled at times with feelings of genuine isolation during her early years in Monaco, finding herself suddenly cut off from the close friendships, creative collaborators, and professional community that had defined so much of her identity throughout her 20s. Letters she wrote to friends back in the United States during this period reportedly reflected a woman working hard to project contentment while privately grappling with homesickness and a sense of having traded one all-consuming, tightly controlled existence, life as a contracted Hollywood star, for another equally demanding and controlled existence as a European princess, with considerably less room for personal autonomy than she may have initially anticipated. She reportedly found some solace in maintaining correspondence with old friends from her acting days, including several former co-stars and directors who continued writing to her for years after she had left the industry entirely, small threads connecting her back to the independent, creative life she had once known, and she occasionally welcomed visitors from her old Hollywood circle to Monaco itself, treasured reminders of a professional world she had walked away from but never entirely stopped missing. Financially, the fairy tale also proved considerably less glamorous than it appeared from the outside. Despite marrying into a reigning royal family, Grace Kelly actually ended her life with remarkably little money to her own name, having spent down much of her own Hollywood earnings and inheritance on the dowry required to marry Rainier in the first place. At the time of her death, decades later, her personal estate reportedly amounted to little more than $10,000 and a modest cottage in Ireland that had once belonged to her grandfather, a strikingly modest sum for a woman who had, on paper, become one of the wealthiest royal figures in all of Europe. As one financial commentator later observed, there was something genuinely poignant about a woman who had effectively paid, quite literally, for the privilege of becoming a princess, only to end her life with a fraction of the wealth she had once earned entirely on her own as one of Hollywood's biggest stars, a detail that rarely, if ever, makes its way into the more romanticized retellings of her story. A family with its own secrets. The pattern of scandal that had defined the Grimaldi family long before Grace Kelly ever arrived in Monaco did not simply disappear once she became princess. If anything, it continued quietly running through the family for decades afterward, eventually surfacing again and again through her own three children. Princess Caroline, the eldest of Grace and Rainier's children, would go on to endure her own turbulent romantic history, including a first marriage to a French businessman named Philippe Junot, a man 17 years her senior, that was annulled after just 2 years amid widespread public speculation about his suitability as a royal husband from the very beginning. Her second marriage, to Italian businessman Stefano Casiraghi, ended in sudden tragedy when he died in a boating accident during a powerboat race off the coast of Monaco in 1990. A tragedy that left Caroline a widow with 3 young children at just 33 years old, plunging her into a period of prolonged and very public grief. She would later enter into a long, complicated relationship with a European prince, Ernst August of Hanover, that eventually led to her third marriage decades later, a union that itself has weathered its own share of public speculation and rumour over the years, including reports of Ernst August's own volatile temper and legal troubles that occasionally made headlines throughout Europe. Princess Stephanie, the youngest of the 3 children, generated headlines of her own throughout the 1990s, most notably when she became involved with and eventually married her own former bodyguard, a man named Daniel Ducrouet, a relationship that produced 2 children before the marriage collapsed less than 2 years later, reportedly after Stephanie discovered him in a compromising situation with another woman, while photographs of the encounter were later published in a tabloid magazine, adding a particularly humiliating and very public dimension to the marriage's collapse that dominated European gossip coverage for months afterward. She would go on to have another child outside of marriage entirely with a separate partner, adding yet another chapter to the family's ongoing, very public pattern of romantic complications playing out across generations. And she briefly worked as a performer with a traveling circus in the years following her divorce, a career choice that generated its own share of tabloid fascination given her royal background, and stood as one of the more unconventional paths any member of a reigning European royal family had taken in recent memory. Perhaps most strikingly, Prince Albert, the couple's only son and eventual heir to the throne, publicly acknowledged fathering a child out of wedlock shortly before formally ascending to the Monegasque throne in 2005, following the death of his father. The news broke only after a French magazine published photographs confirming the child's existence, forcing Albert into an awkward and very public admission just as he was preparing to take on the role of sovereign prince, an embarrassing echo of the very kind of scandal his own grandmother had once quietly carried a generation earlier, and one that arrived at an especially delicate moment given how much emphasis the family had traditionally placed on projecting an image of dignified respectability to the outside world. When pressed by a French television reporter about whether additional children might eventually come forward, Albert offered a strikingly candid response, acknowledging that other similar situations existed without providing further detail. A rare moment of unscripted honesty from a royal family that had spent decades carefully managing its public image. He would later go on to acknowledge at least one additional child, born outside of marriage as well, extending a family pattern of complicated, secretive, romantic entanglements that stretched back through multiple generations of the Grimaldi line, from Rainier's own illegitimate grandmother all the way through to his grandchildren. A recurring thread of scandal and secrecy running quietly beneath the polished fairy tale image the family had worked so hard to project to the outside world for the better part of a century. The final drive. On September 13th, 1982, Princess Grace was driving back from the family's country home at Rock Aigle toward the palace in Monaco, with her 17-year-old daughter Stephanie riding in the passenger seat. It was, by most accounts, an unusual arrangement in itself, since Grace generally preferred being driven by a chauffeur rather than driving herself, particularly given a previous car accident she had been involved in during the 1970s that had reportedly left her considerably more cautious behind the wheel in the years since. On this particular day, however, the car was reportedly packed full of luggage, dresses, and boxes from their weekend at the country house, leaving no room for a driver up front. And Grace took the wheel herself for the winding mountain roads leading back into the principality, a route that included several sharp turns and steep drops along the cliffside. Partway through the drive, Stephanie later recalled her mother complaining of a sudden headache, and moments later, the car veered off the narrow road and plunged down a steep hillside, tumbling roughly 120 feet before coming to rest in the undergrowth below, the vehicle's frame crumpling badly against the terrain as it fell. Emergency responders arrived quickly, and initial statements released by the palace suggested Grace had suffered relatively minor injuries, some broken bones, but nothing considered life-threatening. A public account that would later prove to be significantly understated compared to the true severity of her condition, so understated in fact that palace staff members were reportedly told to continue with their planned vacations rather than return early, an indication of just how little urgency the initial, carefully managed announcement conveyed to those around the family. In reality, doctors treating her privately understood the situation was far more dire, and Grace remained unconscious from the moment she arrived at the hospital around 10:30 that morning. She had suffered two separate strokes, the first of which caused the crash itself, and the second occurring shortly afterward as a direct result of the accident. With no realistic hope of recovery, and after being declared brain dead by attending physicians, Prince Rainier made the devastating decision to remove his wife from life support. Princess Grace died on September 14th, 1982, at the age of 52, just one day after the crash itself. Her funeral, held at the same Monaco cathedral where she had married Rainier 26 years earlier, drew an estimated 100 million television viewers worldwide and was attended by an extraordinary gathering of dignitaries and celebrities, including Nancy Reagan, a young Princess Diana, and Cary Grant, her longtime friend and former co-star, all gathered to say goodbye to a woman whose journey from Philadelphia bricklayer's daughter to European princess had captivated the world for nearly 3 decades. The 75-minute service was, by most accounts, a somber and dignified affair, standing in quiet contrast to the media circus that had surrounded her wedding to Rainier so many years earlier. A final, fitting bookend to a life that had begun under the glare of nearly 2,000 journalists and ended with a nation and much of the watching world in genuine mourning. In the years that followed, persistent rumors circulated suggesting that Stephanie, not Grace, had actually been behind the wheel at the time of the crash, fueled partly by the fact that Stephanie was ultimately extracted from the vehicle through the driver's side door, since the passenger side had been too badly damaged to open, and partly by claims from at least one local witness who insisted he had seen the teenager driving in the moments before the accident. Some versions of the rumor suggested the two had been arguing about Stephanie's own romantic relationships at the time, a distraction that theoretically could have contributed to the accident, regardless of who was actually driving. Stephanie has firmly and repeatedly denied these claims over the years, insisting she was simply thrown around inside the vehicle during the impact and exited through whichever door remained accessible, telling interviewers decades later that she had been tossed around the car just as violently as her mother had been, making any claim that she had somehow remained in full control behind the wheel throughout the crash, difficult to reconcile with her own physical injuries, which included a hairline fracture in her spine. To this day, the exact sequence of events during those final terrifying moments has never been fully and conclusively settled to everyone's satisfaction, remaining one of the more persistent and unresolved mysteries surrounding the otherwise carefully documented public life of one of the 20th century's most famous women. A fairy tale reconsidered. Looking back across the entire arc of Grace Kelly and Prince Rainier's marriage, the pure, uncomplicated fairy tale that captured the world's imagination back in 1956 looks considerably different once all the surrounding details come fully into view. A struggling principality in genuine financial crisis. A billionaire businessman quietly orchestrating a match built around tourism revenue rather than romance alone. A medical fertility exam and a multi-million-dollar payment required before the marriage could even be formally announced. A bride whose own private history may have been far more complicated than the pristine public image constructed around her. And a family whose pattern of scandal, secrecy, and complicated romantic entanglements stretched back for generations before Grace Kelly ever arrived, and continued on through her own children for decades after she was gone. None of this necessarily means genuine affection and partnership weren't present between Grace and Rainier as their marriage unfolded across 26 years together. Prince Albert has spoken movingly in later interviews about the profound and lasting grief his father carried for the rest of his own life following Grace's sudden death, describing a devotion that seemed entirely genuine, regardless of however calculated or transactional the marriage's original beginnings may have been. Rainier reportedly never fully recovered from the loss, and those close to him in his later years described a man who kept his late wife's memory close in nearly every aspect of his remaining time as ruler, right up until his own death in 2005. Almost exactly 50 years after he first crossed paths with the young American actress who would go on to reshape the entire trajectory of both their lives. Rainier never remarried in the more than 2 decades he lived on without her, choosing instead to remain a widower for the rest of his life, a choice several biographers have pointed to as one of the more genuinely convincing pieces of evidence that whatever the marriage's original transactional beginnings, real love had grown between them somewhere along the way. But the fuller picture, the one involving dowries, fertility tests, embezzlement scandals, and generations of complicated family secrets, offers a far more honest and considerably messier version of events than the simple fairy tale that has been repeated in magazines and documentaries for nearly 7 decades now. It's a version of the story that doesn't erase the genuine moments of warmth and partnership that clearly existed between the two of them, but it does complicate the easy, uncomplicated narrative that so many people still carry in their minds when they picture the glamorous American movie star who became a real-life European princess. A narrative that continues appearing in retrospectives and documentaries decades later, often with the more uncomfortable financial and dynastic details quietly left out entirely. Perhaps that's ultimately what makes this story so enduringly fascinating, decades after the wedding itself, and more than 40 years after Grace's tragic death. Not the polished, carefully constructed fantasy of a movie star becoming a real princess, but the far messier, far more human reality sitting quietly underneath it. A reminder that even the most picture-perfect fairy tales usually have considerably more going on behind the scenes than anyone watching from the outside was ever meant to see. Documentaries and biographies continue to revisit this story decades later, precisely because that gap between the polished public myth and the genuinely complicated private reality remains so compelling, offering each new generation of viewers a chance to look past the tiara and the wedding gown and see something closer to the full, complicated truth of two people and an entire family whose lives turned out to be far more human and far messier than the fairy tale ever let on. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.